On April 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee of the Confederate Army surrendered at the village of Appomattox Courthouse, declaring the Union victorious in the American Civil War, the bloodiest war in United States history. The nation was left in a fragile state and pressed with the difficult task of readmitting the states that had seceded from the Union in the beginning of the war. Within the rebel states were a massive population of freedmen, slaves who had been recently freed due to the ratification of the 13th Amendment on April 8, 1864, which abolished slavery and indentured servitude. Homeless and with few possessions, blacks who fled to Union lines for protection found themselves to be dependent on the federal government for their existence as they had been on their masters. When President Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed by Confederate enthusiast John Wilkes Booth, the nation went into a panic. The loss of the steadfast leader was a hard blow to an already wounded country that had been engaged in a civil war only days before. Lincoln's assassination catapulted Vice President Andrew Johnson into power, who handled the entire Reconstruction process in a completely different fashion than Lincoln had intended to. The ex-Confederate-run governments that Johnson allowed to be created slowed Reconstruction extremely and altered the political environment of the South into a conservative powerhouse that still exists today. Lincoln's Reconstruction plan proposed that a general amnesty would be granted to anyone who took an oath of loyalty to the United States and pledged to obey all federal laws pertaining to slavery. This was Lincoln's 10% plan. When 1/10 of the numbers of voters who had participated in the 1860 election had taken the oath within a particular state, then that state could launch a new government within the Union and elect representatives to Congress. High Confederate military and diplomatic leaders would be temporarily excluded from the process of readmission as to ensure that the Confederate politics would not be integrated into the state's new governments. Anti-slavery radical Republicans in Congress criticized Lincoln's leniency because his plan left out any provision for social or economic reconstruction or black civil rights. The Wade-Davis bill was an alternative to Lincoln's 10% plan. Named for its sponsors, Representative Harry Winter Davis of Maryland, a Baltimore congressman and the chairman of the House Select Committee on the Rebellious States, and Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio, the bill firmly asserted congressional control over the rehabilitation of the defeated Confederacy. It formally abolished slavery and prohibited Confederate officials and veterans from voting. The measure set Congress's agenda for post-war reconstruction of the South and foreshadowed conflict with the president over that process. The bill passed Congress, but Lincoln pocket vetoed the bill and was insistent on using the 10% plan. He was convinced that the Wade-Davis bill would make it too difficult to tie the Union back together. John Wilkes Booth was born May 10, 1838, near Bel Air, Maryland. He worked as a distinguished actor in Richmond, Virginia, and Philadelphia, and was an outspoken advocate for slavery and developed a hatred for Lincoln throughout the Civil War. Booth had planned to collaborate with several others to kidnap the president and bring him to Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. When Lincoln didn't arrive at the place that they were waiting, Booth started to hatch another plan. He planned the simultaneous assassinations of Lincoln, Vice President Johnson, and Secretary of State William H. Seward. One of the accomplices wanted nothing to do with it, claiming that he had only signed up for a kidnapping, not a killing. The other two assassinations were a failure, but the centerpiece of the plot was a success. On April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in Ford's Theater, Washington, D.C. Months before the assassination, Booth had been in a play at Ford's Theater, so he was familiar with the layout of the building. The presidential box was supposed to be guarded by John Patrick Parker, who had left the box to go to a tavern. Booth shot Lincoln in the back of the head with his one-shot Derringer pistol, leapt onto the stage, and cried, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus ever to tyrants, Virginia's state motto. Army Major Henry Rathbone, who was with the Lincolns at the play, tried to stop Booth before he could escape, and Booth stabbed him. Booth broke his leg from the fall onto the stage, but still managed to escape the theater on horseback. A doctor and soldiers carried Lincoln to a building across the street, where he was cared for and pronounced dead the next morning. "This is such a lovely play, Mary. I'm so glad we could come." "Yes, dear, I am too." Ha ha ha! "Sic semper tyrannis! The South is avenged!" Booth and an accomplice, David Harold, fled Washington and eventually sought refuge in a Virginia farmhouse. Union troops set fire to the house in an effort to flush the two men out. They had to shoot Booth to get him out of the house. These were his last words. "Useless. Useless." News of the assassination spread across the nation very quickly. People who had recently been celebrating the Union's victory of the Civil War were now shocked by the assassination. On April 21st, 1865, Lincoln's body was loaded onto a train bound for Springfield, Illinois, the president's hometown. The train carrying Lincoln's body traveled through 180 cities and 7 states on its way to Springfield. Scheduled stops for the special funeral train were published in newspapers around the nation. Thousands of people flocked to the streets to pay their respect to the president, whose body was loaded off of the train and onto a horse-drawn hearse for public viewing. In some cities, it took over 5 hours to pass by the president's coffin. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency after Lincoln's assassination and took advantage of his power in office to alter the course of Reconstruction. Johnson had remained in the Senate even after his home state of Tennessee seceded, making him a hero in the North and a traitor in the South. In 1864, the Republicans, contending that their National Union Party was for all loyal men, nominated Johnson, a Southerner and a Democrat, for vice president. He was sworn into office the morning of Lincoln's death. Johnson championed populist measure and supported states' rights. In Johnson's view, the Southern states had never given up their right to govern themselves, and the federal government had no right to determine voting requirements or other questions at the state level. His approach to Reconstruction was very different from Lincoln's proposed 10% plan. Johnson granted amnesty to most former Confederates and allowed rebel states to build their own governments with few restrictions from the federal government. He pardoned all who would take an oath of allegiance, but required leaders and men of wealth to obtain special presidential pardons. Many people in the North were convinced that Johnson's policy and the actions of the governments he established threatened to revert African American rights to a state similar to slavery, while allowing former Confederate officials to regain political power in the South. These newly elected governments quickly enacted black codes, measures designed to control and repress the recently freed slave population. Although they were no longer slaves, freedmen were uneducated and thus were subject to exploitation and mistreatment from many whites, particularly in the South. Black codes included measures such as these. Race was defined by blood. The presence of any amount of black blood made someone black. Freedmen had to be employed. Violators faced vagrancy charges. Freedmen were not allowed to assemble without supervision of a white person. Freedmen were assumed to be agricultural workers and their duties and hours were highly regulated. Freedmen were not allowed to be taught to read or write. Public facilities were segregated. Violators of the laws were subject to punishments like branding and whipping. The racist culture put in place by black codes would stay very much present in the United States all the way into the civil rights movement during the 1960s. In 1866, Johnson vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and the Civil Rights Bill, legislation aimed at protecting blacks. The Civil Rights Bill mandated that all persons born in the United States, with the exception of American Indians, were hereby declared to be citizens of the United States, and would become the first federal legislation defending black rights after Congress overrode Johnson's veto of the bill. When Congress passed the 14th Amendment to the Constitution that conferred citizenship on all persons born or naturalized in the United States and guaranteed them equal protection under the law, the President urged the states not to ratify it. He tried to veto the amendment, but it was overridden by Congress. In an attempt to garner support for his cause, Johnson launched a speaking campaign that he dubbed a swing around the circle. Treason against the government is the highest crime that can be committed, and those engaged in it should suffer all its penalties. The day for protecting the land and Negroes of these authors of rebellion is the past. After making these treasons odious, every Union man should be remunerated out of the pockets of those who had inflicted this great suffering on the country. Their great plantations must be seized and divided into small farms and sold to honest, industrious men. The speaking tour saw initial success, but as heckling and taunting started from the crowd, increased as the tour continued, Johnson lost his composure and was no longer able to speak over the objections from the audience. Johnson's pro-slavery-driven actions against rights for freedmen resulted in severe oppression of freed slaves in the southern states, as well as the return of high-ranking officials and pre-war aristocrats to power in state and federal governments. The Democratic Party practically monopolized the New South into the 1960s, when the civil rights and voting rights of African Americans were restored by Congress. Because of John Wilkes Booth's single bullet fired almost 150 years ago, the world will never know what Lincoln had planned for future Reconstruction legislation, or how the country would have fared if Andrew Johnson had never been president.